The millionaire's autistic son always felt excluded and lonely, unable to make friends, and each day that weighed like guilt on the father's heart. But everything changes on an unexpected afternoon. Arriving home early from work, the millionaire freezes at the living room door. His heart almost stops when he sees what the humble new babysitter and his son were doing together. The rain hammered against the windows of the beachfront apartment, a constant, mournful rhythm that mirrored the silence within those walls. Alexander Thorne watched the dance of the drops, his hand resting on the cold glass. From the 20th floor, the city of Los Angeles seemed a blur of gray and water, a smudge of distant lights that failed to warm the emptiness in his chest. The watch on his wrist, a piece of Swiss engineering worth more than a luxury sedan, marked 7 a.m. To him, it was just another reminder of time slipping away, relentless and void. The immense fortune he had built, a patrimony constructed through aggressive stocks, shrewd investments, and an almost inhuman dedication to business, now felt like a gilded frame around a blank canvas. He was a man who knew how to turn capital into more capital, yet felt powerless to generate a single genuine smile in his own son. Leo, his 7-year-old, lived in a private universe, a refugee protected by noise, cancelling headphones, and an overwhelming passion for dinosaurs. Since his mother's passing, the outside world had become too loud, too hostile. Silence, once a choice, had become the rule of the house. The intercom buzzed precisely on time. Alex adjusted the collar of his dress shirt, the armor he donned every day. It was the nanny candidate, the 12th in less than a year. Most lasted only a few weeks. Unable to breach the invisible barrier Leo erected around himself, Alex walked to the door, his impeccable posture contrasting with the disarray in his soul. When he opened it, he found a simple-looking young woman with large eyes and a spiral-bound notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. She wore modest clothing that looked even humbler in the building's sumptuous lobby. Sophie, the resume stated, 24, resident of a modest neighborhood outside the city, studying for a community college certification. He assessed her with the same calculating gaze he used to evaluate the profitability of a new financial asset. His expectations were non-existent. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Alex merely nodded, indicating the white leather sofa. As he prepared for the standard interview protocol, Sophie's gaze didn't fix on him, nor on the oppressive luxury of the room. Her eyes swept the living area and landed on the small figure sitting on the rug. His back to them, Leo was methodically lining up his dinosaur figures, completely immersed. Sophie smiled, a discreet smile that softened the tension in her face. It was the first time someone had looked at the boy first. Alex felt a discomfort, a pang of something he couldn't name. He began the questions, discussing hours, responsibilities, the need for discretion. Sophie answered concisely, but her eyes kept returning to Leo. Then she opened the notebook. Inside were colorful drawings, pictograms, and what appeared to be handmade game boards. "I prepared some sensory games," she explained, not looking at him directly, "to figure out what he likes on his own schedule." Alex frowned. It wasn't what he expected. He was used to educators bringing complex theories and empty promises. This was simple, too personal. He ended the interview with cold formality, promising to be in touch. Hiring her felt like an extremely high-risk investment, but the image of her, looking at Leo not as a problem to be solved, but as a world to be discovered, was etched in his mind. Out of sheer exhaustion, he decided to take the risk. The following Monday, Sophie started. The silence, however, remained. The first week was a repeat of the previous ones. Alex left early, returned late, and the house remained a sanctuary of quietude. On Friday, though, a meeting was cancelled. He arrived home 3 hours early. The shy afternoon sun broke through the clouds, painting the marble floor with golden stripes. He turned the key in the lock, expecting the usual silence. But what he heard made him stop in the middle of the hall, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound he thought was extinct. Laughter, electric, genuine, coming from the living room. It was his son's. For a moment, Alex thought he was mistaken. The sound was so foreign to the apartment's acoustics that it could have been a TV on an unusual volume, an echo from the neighbors. But no, the laughter was unmistakable, a high, pure timbre he kept in his memory like a precious relic. He walked slowly, his expensive shoes making no sound on the marble floor. His heart racing as if he were about to close the most important deal of his life. He stopped at the threshold of the living room door, invisible, a clandestine spectator in his own house. The scene that unfolded before him made the air leave his lungs. Leo was sitting on the sofa, his feet dangling inches from the floor. His body leaned forward with fierce concentration. In his small hands, he held the video game controller, his fingers moving with surprising agility. Next to him, so close their shoulders almost touched, was Sophie. She wasn't playing, she was narrating, her voice soft and animated, turning the on-screen car race into an epic radio broadcast. And there he goes, the speedy T-Rex, making the tight curve, leaving the turbo triceratops eating dust. Watch out for the banana peel. Champ, dodge it. Yes. Alex noticed the details, the small changes that transformed the environment. The overhead lights, normally cold and corporate white tea, were dimmed, emitting a yellowish, cozy glow. A soft throw blanket, which he didn't even remember owning, covered Leo's legs. The television, a state-of-the-art panel, had its brightness and contrast reduced, making the colors less aggressive. And on the coffee table, next to a glass of water, was a board with figures. A visual schedule, he realized. Simple drawings indicated the sequence. Play, pause, water, breathe. It was a system, a logic that gave predictability to the chaos of the world. Sophie had created a safe dome around the playtime, a space where Leo could just be a child, the boy who in Alex's rare attempts at interaction barely held eye contact, who communicated in monosyllables or silence, suddenly turned to her. He didn't use words, he just touched Sophie's arm with his fingertips, a hesitant gesture, yet loaded with intent. His gaze met hers, and for a second that seemed an eternity to the father observing them, he connected. Then, the voice Alex had almost forgotten the sound of, clear and without the filter of reluctance, filled the room. Again, at that instant, something broke inside Alex. The armor of discipline and pride, forged to navigate the competitive business world and protect his net worth from any vulnerability, cracked. The guilt for all the hours he had spent away, for all the laughter he had missed, hit him with the force of a wave. That apartment, which had always been an extension of his office, cold, functional, and silent, suddenly remembered what it was like to be a home. Joy, an emotion he had filed away along with the photos of his wife, was right there, alive, pulsing in the middle of his living room. Sophie hadn't just broken the silence. She had brought the color back. He retreated, making no sound, and went to his study. He sat in his leather chair but didn't turn on the computer. He sat there, in the dark, listening to the sounds coming from the living room, the hum of the video game and the melody of her voice, mixed with the victorious exclamations of his son. For the first time in a long time, the multi-millionaire Alexander Thorne wasn't thinking about interest rates, dividends, or the cash flow of his companies. He thought that perhaps the greatest investment of his life wasn't on the stock exchange, but in that young woman with a notebook who, in less than a week, had found a treasure he thought was lost forever. The forced proximity between them, which began as a mere contract of employment, now gained a new dimension. He didn't know it, but that afternoon was the start of a routine that would challenge all his certainties and expose the fragility of his fortress. And the first challenge was already knocking, disguised as a phone call from Leo's school. The house changed. The change wasn't in the expensive furniture or the panoramic view, but in the air they breathed. Under Sophie's discreet guidance, a new language took hold of the apartment. Colorful pictograms, drawn and laminated by her, now dotted the walls in strategic locations: the toothbrush next to the bathroom mirror, the plate of food on the fridge, the toy dinosaur on the bedroom door. They were visual anchors, small islands of predictability in the ocean of stimuli that the world was for Leo. Alex, at first, observed everything with calculated skepticism. It seemed amateurish, a simplistic solution to a complex problem, but the results were undeniable. Mornings, previously marked by silent tension, now flowed with negotiated order. Leo, who used to refuse to wear his school uniform, now pointed to the sequence of figures: breakfast, get dressed, brush teeth. He accepted the routine because he understood it. The biggest surprise for Alex was the yes and no workshop, a game Sophie invented. Sitting on the rug, she would show cards with situations. Want ice cream? Want a bath now? Leo was learning to use words to express his wishes, and every yes or no was celebrated as a major achievement. The toughest negotiation, however, was the video game. Sophie transformed it from an escape tool into a bargaining chip, half an hour of gaming for a trip to the local park. Alex found it strange, resisted. His instinct was to limit, forbid, control. But he yielded, and one sunny afternoon, he saw his son, wearing his protective headphones, sit on the sand and observe other children for 10 whole minutes. He didn't interact, but he didn't run away either. It was a silent victory. A small advance into enemy territory. The chemistry between the adults, meanwhile, was igniting in the details. One evening, as Sophie was explaining the next day's schedule, pointing to the figures on the coffee table, her hand and Alex's crossed as they reached for the same glass of water. It was a brief, accidental touch, but an electric current seemed to run through his arm. Sophie withdrew her hand as if she had touched fire, her face flushing. Their eyes met for a second, a glimpse of unknown and dangerous territory, before both retreated, finding refuge in the safe pretext of caring for Leo. It was in this climate of fragile hope that the first antagonist revealed itself. The phone rang. It was Ms. Eleanor Vance, the school coordinator. Her voice was sugary, but with an underpinning of steel. "Mr. Thorne, so good to speak with you. I've been observing Leonardo. There are changes." Alex felt a chill. "Good changes, I hope." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "He seems more agitated, and I heard from a teacher that he mentioned spending hours playing video games. You know, our school values pedagogical stimulation. Gaming is not therapy." Every word was a veiled criticism, a polite dismissal of Sophie's method. Alex looked at the living room, where Leo was assembling a puzzle on the floor, focused and calm. The image violently contrasted with the coordinator's insinuation. He, who built his empire based on data and results, saw living proof that this worked. But Mrs. Vance's voice represented the system, the status, the facade of normalcy that his wealth had always allowed him to buy. "I appreciate the concern," he replied, his voice harder than he intended. "But I am monitoring this closely." Ms. Vance was unfazed. "I believe it would be prudent for us to speak in person. Perhaps the new nanny needs some guidance on our protocols. We need to ensure that the domestic environment is not in conflict with our pedagogical approach." The phrase hung in the air, a subtle threat. She wasn't suggesting a partnership. She was demanding submission. She was putting Sophie and everything she represented under scrutiny. Alex hung up the phone, but Miss Vance's voice continued to echo in his mind. cold and sharp as steel. Threat, that's what he felt. A threat to the small bubble of peace Sophie had so carefully built. The coordinator didn't see the brightness in Leo's eyes, didn't hear the sentences that were starting to form, hesitant but complete. She saw only the breach of a protocol, an anomaly in her perfectly ordered system. He, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking, felt cornered by a private school director. The irony was bitter. His vast wealth seemed useless against veiled prejudice and the bureaucracy of conformity. The next day brought the second blow, in the form of Sergio, his image consultant. Sergio was an impeccable man whose job was to ensure that Alexander Thorne's name was always associated with success, discretion, and power. He entered Alex's office with a tablet in hand and a worried expression that, like everything about him, seemed rehearsed. "Alex, we need to align a few things," he began, with the smooth voice of someone about to deliver bad news. "Your personal life, or the lack thereof, has always been an asset to your brand. The widower dedicated to work and his son. It's a strong narrative, but I'm hearing whispers." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Whispers? The new nanny. She is very present. She was seen with you and the boy at the park. People talk. It's inevitable." Sergio paused, choosing his words like a surgeon. "Mixing your personal life with a humble nanny from a modest neighborhood, that could scratch your reputation, Alex. It could project an image of vulnerability, of poor judgment. The market is cruel, you know. They don't see a father. They see a billionaire whose decisions affect his stock value." The accusation was clear. Sophie was a liability, a risk to his net worth. Alex felt his blood boil. "My son is happy, Sergio, for the first time in years. And that's wonderful," the consultant quickly interjected. "But perception is reality. Just be careful." The conversation left him with a taste of ashes in his mouth. It was an attack from a new front, one he hadn't expected. The battle wasn't just over Sophie's methodology, but over her very existence in his world of luxury. The perfect storm, however, formed hours later. During a video conference with Martinez, one of his company's main investors. Martinez was a shark, a man who only understood the language of numbers. And the numbers, according to him, were not good. "Your last performance report is below expectation, Alexander," as he said, the pixelated image on the screen not diminishing the hardness of his tone. "You seem distracted. I heard you cancelled 2 important meetings last week." "I had personal matters," Alex replied. His jaw tight, Martinez let out a short, humorless laugh. "Domestic issues don't generate profit. We have a crucial investment round approaching. The Swiss are hesitant. They demand your presence in Zurich to close the deal. Next week, it's non-negotiable." The demand landed like a sentence. Going to Zurich meant leaving Leo at the exact moment stability was starting to take root. It meant abandoning the battlefield, leaving Sophie alone to deal with the school and the ghosts of that house. It meant proving Sergio and the coordinator right, that, in the end, business would always come first. "Alexander," Martinez's voice brought him back, "are we clear? Your presence is fundamental to secure this capital." The triple pressure, from the school, the consultant, the investor, formed a knot in his throat. Each pulled a string, demanding a part of him he no longer knew how to reconcile. Alex felt like one of his financial assets, being divided and valued for his immediate profitability. The tranquility that had begun to blossom in his house now seemed like a fragile greenhouse in the middle of a hurricane. He spent the night sleepless, his mind spinning through risk charts and loss scenarios. Losing the Swiss investment would mean a hard blow to his business, a stain on his reputation as a Midas. But the image that haunted him wasn't that of a falling stock graph, but Leo's hesitant touch on Sophie's arm. What was worth more? The respect of an anonymous investor in Zurich, or the trust that was being reborn in his son's eyes? For the first time, the scale he always used to weigh his decisions seemed unbalanced. The weekend arrived tense, laden with clouds and undeclared decisions. Alex was quieter than usual, his mind thousands of miles away, in a Zurich boardroom. Sophie noticed the change. She didn't ask, didn't invade his space. She just continued her work with the same serene dedication, like a lighthouse refusing to extinguish in the storm. On Sunday morning, she suggested an outing. The farmer's market downtown. It has music, colors, smells. We can stay just a little while, if Leo doesn't feel comfortable. Alex was going to refuse. The idea of being exposed in public, of fueling the whispers Sergio had mentioned, it paralyzed him. But then Leo, who was listening to the conversation from across the room, approached. He held a card in his hand, one of the ones Sophie had created in the yes and no workshop. He extended the green card with the word yes in capital letters to his father. The simple gesture, but one of monumental clarity, disarmed Alex. Saying no would be like tearing up that small piece of paper and everything it represented. He sighed, defeated and, at the same time, saved by his son's small victory. All right, let's go. The market was a chaos of stimuli. Colorful fruit stalls, the smell of street food and fresh coffee, the sound of dozens of conversations overlapping. Alex felt his protective instinct sharpen. He kept Leo close, a firm hand on his shoulder, ready for retreat at the first sign of discomfort. Leo wore his headphones, a filter for the excessive noise, but his eyes were wide, absorbing everything. They stopped in front of a wooden toy stall. Leo pointed to a set of small cars. Next to them, another child, the same age, was playing with a similar model. Alex held his breath. Social interaction was the biggest challenge. The boy looked at Leo. Leo, from behind his glasses, sustained the gaze for a second. Then, slowly, he pushed one of his cars toward the other boy, a silent invitation. The other boy smiled and pushed his back. For a few minutes, they stood there side by side, without words, just sharing the rhythmic movement of the toys. Sophie watched from a distance, a contained smile on her lips. It was then that the sound of a lively Latin band cut through the air. A musician, sitting on a stool, played an upbeat salsa melody, happy and contagious. Leo turned his head toward the music. He took off his headphones. Alex braced for the meltdown. The sensory collapse that loud sound usually provoked, but it didn't happen. Leo stood still, listening. A slight sway began in his body, an almost imperceptible movement, in rhythm with the music. A smile, big and genuine, illuminated his face. He turned to his father, his eyes shining with an intensity Alex had never seen. And then the words came, not a monosyllable, not a rehearsed phrase, a whole sentence, hesitant but enormous in its meaning. "Dad, I want to show my favorite dinosaur to him." He pointed to the boy with the cars. Alex felt his eyes burn. He turned away, raising his sunglasses to hide the tears that flowed without permission. In that moment, in that noisy market, he understood. The real treasure wasn't stored in vaults in Zurich or in cryptocurrency portfolios. It was right there, in his son's voice, finally finding its way out. But joy, like the happiness of the careless, is short-lived. From afar, without them noticing, a woman raised her cell phone. The camera focused on Sophie's tender gesture, adjusting Leo's shirt collar. The click was silent, but the damage would be deafening. The silent click of the cell phone was the fuse on a time bomb. Alex and Sophie, absorbed in Leo's contained joy, didn't notice the malicious gaze of the woman. She was one of the school mothers, a prominent figure in the WhatsApp groups, known for her sharp tongue and the need to be the center of attention. For her, the scene was a goldmine, the humble nanny, the difficult child, and the reclusive millionaire father. It was an irresistible narrative, ready to be distorted and consumed. The photo, followed by a short video showing Sophie holding Leo's hand affectionately as they walked, was posted in the class parents group before they even left the market. The caption was a masterpiece of malice disguised as concern. Such intense attachment from the new nanny with little Leo. Important to have boundaries, don't you think? For the child's sake. The insinuation was pure venom. In a few minutes, the conversation exploded. Comments poured in, each crueler than the last. People like her will do anything to keep the job. Be careful, Alex. Soon she'll think she's the mother. This could confuse a child on the spectrum. Sophie only learned about the fire hours later, when she arrived home. Her neighborhood, in the modest part of town, was a stark contrast to the opulence of the coast. The houses were simple. The sound was of neighbors chatting on the sidewalk, and the smell of fresh coffee her aunt always made at that hour. She went into her small room, her heart still warmed by Leo's smile. She picked up her cell phone to reply to a message from a classmate and saw the notifications. A friend, who had a cousin in the same school, sent the screenshots of the conversation. Sophie read the messages, one by one, and each word was like a small shard of glass on her skin. The old fear, the feeling of not belonging that had accompanied her since childhood, swallowed her. The phrase she heard most often growing up, people like her don't belong in fancy places, echoed in her mind with the force of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They didn't see her work, her studies, her dedication. They saw only her origin, her zip code. They saw a threat, a usurper. The rejection, the monster she fought so hard to keep dormant, awoke hungry. The day's joy turned into a knot of anguish. She sat on the bed, her chest tight, her hands trembling. Her first reaction was the usual one: retreat, disappear, resign, protect herself from that humiliation and, above all, protect Leo and Alex from the confusion her presence was causing. It would be easier for everyone. She didn't want to be the pivot of a crisis, didn't want to stain anyone's reputation. Her place wasn't there. That's what life had always told her. With a heavy heart, she started packing her bag for the next day, already rehearsing the words of farewell. As she picked up the sensory games notebook she had taken to the market, a folded piece of paper fell out. She opened it. It was a drawing, done with Leo's uncertain hand. 3 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, and one with long hair, holding hands. Above them, a large red heart, and underneath, the crooked words, written with visible effort, "You make me happy, Mommy." Sophie clapped a hand over her mouth, a sob escaping without permission. The word "mommy" hit her like a punch and a hug at the same time. She knew it wasn't an act of substitution. It was the way Leo, with his emotional vocabulary still under construction, found to name the feeling of security, comfort, and joy she provided him. It was the greatest honor and the heaviest burden she could receive. She didn't want to usurp any place. But how could she abandon that boy who, for the first time, was naming his affections? The drawing in her hands wasn't just a piece of paper, it was an anchor. In the middle of the storm of venom and prejudice, it was the only real thing, the only truth that mattered. Resigning would be safer for her, but it would be a betrayal of that red heart drawn on the paper. She folded the drawing carefully, the tears wetting the paper, and guarded it close to her chest. The decision was made. She wouldn't flee, she would fight. But she didn't imagine that the next battle would be so imminent and so devastating. The week started under a fragile and silent truce. Leo's drawing was kept in Sophie's wallet, a talisman against the sideways glances and whispers she felt hovering in the air. Alex, meanwhile, had been informed by Sergio about the small online storm. As the consultant minimized it and instructed to maintain discretion, he felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing the visible recovery of his son on one side and the ruthless demands of his world on the other. Peace, however, was an illusion. The turning point came in the form of a notice from the school, printed on colorful, festive paper, the first general rehearsal for the annual spring carnival. For most parents, it was a cause for celebration. For Sophie, it was a fire alarm. The combination of loud music, the strong smell of popcorn and sweet treats, the flashing lights, and the crowd of excited children was the exact recipe for a sensory meltdown. She spent the previous night preparing Leo, using the visual schedule to explain each step, creating a pause card he could show when he felt overwhelmed, and agreeing on a refuge point, the school's quiet library. But no preparation could have prepared them for the reality. The gymnasium, decorated with vibrant banners, was a cacophony of sounds and movements. An improvised dance was being rehearsed to the sound of booming music, while other children ran and screamed. Leo gripped Sophie's hand, his knuckles white. He put on his protective headphones, but the deep beat of the drums still vibrated through his body. The smell of popcorn popping in a machine in the corner made him wrinkle his nose. He lasted 7 minutes, a record of bravery. Then, the inevitable happened. An animated teacher popped a bag of colorful balloons in the middle of the yard. The sharp, unexpected sound was the last straw. Leo flinched, his hands covering his headphones tightly, his body starting to rock back and forth. A low moan escaped his throat. Sophie didn't hesitate. She wrapped him in her arms, whispering words of calm, and guided him out of the gymnasium toward the library. In the hallway, Ms. Vance's figure materialized, her expression severe. "Where do you think you're going? The rehearsal has barely started. He's overloaded. He needs a moment of silence," Sophie explained, her voice firm but respectful. The coordinator looked her up and down, a sneer on her lips. "This is what happens with overprotection. He'll never adapt if you treat him like glass. You're creating a fragile child." The accusation hit her at her most vulnerable point. At that exact moment, Alex's phone vibrated in his office. On the line, Martinez, the investor, was relentless. "The decision is yours, Alexander. Either you come to Zurich or our capital goes elsewhere. Simple as that." In the middle of the pressure, the other line rang. It was Mrs. Vance. "Mr. Thorne, I had to call. Leonardo had a severe meltdown. The nanny removed him from the rehearsal against the teacher's instruction. I believe her approach, this safe dome, is causing him to regress." Alex felt the floor disappear. The two voices, the investors and the coordinators, merged into a single accusation. He was failing on all fronts, pressed, cornered, with the fear of losing everything, the business and the son. He committed his harshest mistake. Arriving at the school to pick up Leo, he found Sophie in the hallway. She was sitting next to the boy, who was now calmly drawing in his notebook. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't give her the benefit of the doubt. His face was a mask of stress and decision. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and emotionless, "from now on, I need maximum discretion. Do not confront the school. Do not question their methods. Just do your job and don't make waves." The words fell like stones on the fragile bond of trust they had built. She looked at him, her large eyes, previously full of hope, now emptying. Sophie swallowed hard, the bitter taste of disappointment burning her throat. She nodded once, and in that moment, the sparkle in her eyes, the light that had reanimated that cold house, went out. The drive back from school was made in a silence that weighed more than any argument. It wasn't the peaceful quiet that sometimes settled when Leo slept in the back seat. It was a silence of absence, a vacuum where Sophie's soft voice explaining the world or Leo's curious questions had once been. Alex drove, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel, his mind replaying his own words. "Don't make waves." He had created a dam. Sophie, in the passenger seat, stared fixedly out the window, her profile silhouetted against the grey city landscape. She wasn't truly there anymore. Her body occupied the space, but her essence, The creativity and warmth that had captivated him had retreated to a safe, inaccessible place. Leo, in his car seat, was too quiet. His eyes fixed on an invisible point, the headphones pressed harder than usual. The arrival home only confirmed the change. The apartment, which had recently smelled of freshly baked goods and the sound of laughter, seemed to have reverted in time. The tall walls and immense windows seemed to once again breathe the dust of solitude. In the days that followed, the new routine solidified, cold and precise like clockwork. Sophie arrived at the exact time. She carried out all tasks with impeccable efficiency. The visual schedule was followed strictly, but without the playful narration. The breathing breaks were timed, devoid of the former kindness. She had become the perfect employee. He, in his foolishness, had demanded discreet, efficient, and invisible. She no longer offered suggestions, didn't bring new games, didn't risk a look that could be misinterpreted. Alex, the master of finance who measured success in profit and profitability, felt emotionally bankrupt. He had obtained the discretion he asked for, but the price was his son's joy. And Leo felt the absence more than anyone. The boy, who had begun to blossom, to use his voice and seek interaction, visibly regressed. He returned to communicating through monosyllabic gestures. The yes and no cards were forgotten in a drawer. The video game, once a bridge to connection, returned to being a solitary escape. The most painful image for Alex was seeing his son on the living room rug. Instead of building adventure scenarios with his dinosaurs, Leo was lining them up again, perfect, rigid rows by color and size. It was his old defense mechanism, a way to put order into the chaos he felt inside, the order Alex had imposed on his professional life, the same one that made him a multi-millionaire, now manifested on his living room rug as a symptom of pain. The cold was back, and with it, the fear of having broken something that might not be fixable, the fear of, once again, having chosen the wrong thing, of having prioritized the appearance of control over the substance of affection. He realized that his fortune, his assets, all his capital could not buy back the sparkle in Sophie's eyes or Leo's hesitant phrases. On Thursday night, the house was plunged into the usual oppressive quiet. Sophie had already left. Leo was asleep. Alex, unable to work, wandered through the living room. His eyes fell on Sophie's game notebook, which had been left on the coffee table. He picked it up, his hands feeling the simple texture of the cardboard. He opened it, flipping through the pages with the drawings and pictograms that had been the key to his son's world. On the last page there was a recent drawing by Leo. It was a scene from the schoolyard, several children on one side and a boy alone on the other. Above the lonely boy's head, Leo had written, with shaky, mirrored handwriting, a word Alex didn't immediately understand. It wasn't a name, nor an object. It looked like a nickname. Mute T-Rex. Mute T-Rex. The two words on the paper were crueler than any insult Alex had ever received in his business life. They were a sentence, a label that explained everything. The isolation, the retreat into silence, the need to line up the dinosaurs like an army to protect himself from a world that hurt him. The Tyrannosaurus Rex, the king, the strongest of all, reduced to silence. It was the perfect metaphor for his son's pain. In that instant, Alex understood the depth of his mistake. He had not only silenced Sophie, he had become complicit in the silence that was suffocating Leo. While he worried about the value of his stocks and the perception of anonymous investors, his most precious asset was being devalued in the only place where he should have been safe. The overprotection that Ms. Vance had accused Sophie of wasn't overprotection. It was protection. It was Leo's only line of defense against a childhood cruelty that adults, for convenience, refused to see. Guilt hit him not like a wave, but like a slow, painful drowning. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was different. There was a determination in Alex's eyes that hadn't been there before. When Sophie arrived, he didn't greet her with the usual formal nod. He waited for her in the living room, standing, holding Leo's notebook. "I saw this," he said, his voice hoarse, pointing to the drawing. "I understand now. And I am sorry I was blind." Sophie looked at the drawing, then at his eyes. She didn't see the billionaire accustomed to giving orders, but a desperate father admitting his failure. The wall of ice that had risen between them began to melt. She didn't say, "I told you so." There was no triumph in her gaze, only the empathy that was her driving force. "He didn't tell me with words," she said softly. "He drew it. It's his way of showing us where it hurts." Alex nodded, swallowing hard. "What are we going to do? I can't let this continue. I'm not going to Zurich. My only priority investment is him." The determination in his voice gave Sophie the courage she needed. She took a deep breath, the invisible employee giving way to the passionate educator. "We need a plan, an ethical and firm plan. Fleeing or simply changing schools without addressing the root of the problem won't help him long term." She picked up her own notebook, the games one, and opened it to a blank page. "First, we will request a mediated meeting with the school, Miss Vance, and the classroom teacher, but we won't go alone." Her gaze was incisive. "I know an excellent psychoeducator, Dr. Anya Sharma. She works at the community health clinic in my neighborhood. She specializes in conflict mediation and inclusion." Sophie paused. "Funnily enough, the clinic receives an anonymous annual donation that funds the child psychology core. The donation comes from one of your social investment funds." Alex stared at her, surprised. He had quietly sponsored that project for years, a gesture to balance the moral liabilities of his immense wealth. Using that resource now felt like a cosmic alignment. Her presence, as a professional from a public service, prevents the school from ignoring us or stalling. Sophie continued. "Second, we will prepare Leo. He needs to participate, to have a voice. We can create a "can I speak" good card so he feels in control." The idea was brilliant, transforming the victim into an agent of his own defense. "And third, we will propose concrete sensory adjustments for the spring carnival. Less crowded time, a quiet resting room, headphones available for other children who need them. We will show that inclusion is not about removing the child, it's about adapting the environment." The plan was bold, intelligent, and, above all, centered on Leo's well-being. Alex felt a surge of admiration for this woman. She didn't have a net worth in dollars, but she possessed a richness of spirit he could never measure. "I'm in for everything," he said, without hesitation. "Make the calls you need. I will be by your side." He picked up the phone. The first call wouldn't be to cancel the trip to Zurich. It would be to the number of his son's school, to schedule the meeting that would change everything. The battle was about to begin. The school meeting room was small and stuffy, smelling of disinfectant and old paper. Miss Vance sat at the head of the table, a queen in her modest castle, flanked by the classroom teacher who looked uncomfortable. On the other side, Alex and Sophie formed a united front. Next to them, Dr. Sharma, with her thin-rimmed glasses and unshakable serenity, observed the environment with the clinical gaze of someone who knows that the real illness is not in the patient. Leo sat on a chair a little distance away, with his drawing pad, an agreement so he felt secure, but present. Ms. Vance began with a polished speech about the challenges of inclusion and the need for resilience, empty words that served as a shield for inaction. She tried to stall, suggesting the creation of a study group to evaluate the situation next semester. That's when Alex interrupted her, his voice calm, but with a weight she couldn't ignore. "We are not here to evaluate, Mrs. Vance. We are here to solve today." Dr. Sharma then took the floor, her voice transforming what was a parent's complaint into an institutional diagnosis. She spoke about hostile environments, about the school's responsibility to mediate conflicts, and about how derogatory nicknames, who for a child on the spectrum are not just a joke, but the demolition of his identity. Mrs. Vance squirmed in her chair, the forced smile disappearing. Sophie then placed Leo's notebook in the center of the table, open to the drawing page. "Mute T-Rex," she said, her voice choked but firm. "That's how he feels, the most powerful dinosaur of all, without a voice. That's what he hears when he enters this school every day." The silence that followed was dense. The teacher lowered her eyes, ashamed. It was at that moment that Leo stood up. He walked slowly to the table, holding a small blue card Sophie had prepared for him. Written on it was, "Can I speak?" All eyes turned to him. Alex felt his heart stop. Leo extended the card to Dr. Sharma, who nodded with an encouraging smile. The boy looked at the two children who had been called to the room to represent the class. His voice came out trembling, a thread of sound in the heavy silence. When you call me that name, my chest gets tight, and the words go away." He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just uttered his truth, simple and devastating. The silence that fell afterwards was like a heavy veil, suffocating all excuses and justifications. One of the boys muttered a "sorry." The other just looked away, her face red. It was a victory, imperfect, painful, but a victory. Ms. Vance, cornered by the presence of the public health professional, agreed to implement Sophie's suggestions, including classroom mediation and adjustments for the carnival. Leaving the school, Alex felt a pride that no successful stock market transaction had ever provided him. He placed his hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of complicity and admiration. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his account manager in Switzerland, short and brutal. "Alexander, I regret to inform you, Martinez called. The board backed out. The investment round has been cancelled. The justification cited was executive leadership instability." No. Before he could process the blow, another message arrived. It was from Sergio, his consultant. "The rumor about the school meeting is already spreading. This is a public relations disaster. If you insist on this personal exposure, this courageous father crusade, I cannot continue. Consider this my final warning." Alex put the phone in his pocket, the cold metal against his skin. He looked at Sophie and Leo walking ahead of him in the afternoon sun. The victory tasted sweet, but the price, he realized, was only just beginning to be collected. And it was a price that could cost him the empire he had spent his entire life building. The victory at school was like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples spread quickly, and not all were benign. The news of the cancelled Swiss investment leaked to the specialized press, generating a wave of speculation. The value of his company's stock began to fall, slowly at first, then with frightening speed. Alex watched his fortune shrink in real time, the numbers on his computer screen turning an aggressive red. He spent hours in conference calls, trying to calm other investors, ensuring business stability, but felt he was trying to staunch a hemorrhage with a band-aid. Sergio's warning materialized. The consultant resigned via formal email, citing irreconcilable differences in strategy. Alex was alone at the helm of a ship in a storm, and the cause of the storm was his choice to be, first and foremost, a father. In the midst of this professional chaos, the final trap was set, coming from the same source that started the attack. The mother who spread the market video, feeling her status in the parents' group threatened by the school's turnaround, decided to double down. She drafted a long email to the school administration, copying other influential parents. It was a carefully constructed piece of fiction, full of pseudo-psychological terms, in which she denounced an alleged inappropriate affective transference between Leo and Sophie. She claimed the nanny was intentionally substituting the maternal figure, and that this was causing profound emotional confusion in the child. using Leo's own meltdown at the spring carnival as proof of her argument. It was a blatant lie, but it was plausible to those who wanted to believe. The complaint was the weapon Miss Vance needed. She called Alex for an emergency meeting, this time without Dr. Sharma's presence. With the printed email on the table, she was direct. "Mr. Thorne, the situation is unsustainable. We have a formal complaint from another parent. The school cannot be complicit in a relationship that may be harmful to your son. I demand the immediate dismissal of the nanny." The accusation was absurd, but the context made it dangerous. With his company's reputation at stake, the last thing Alex needed was a scandal involving his son and his personal life. He was being blackmailed. The school was using the false complaint as a pretext to get rid of Sophie, the woman who had exposed their failures. Cornered, exhausted, and feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, Alex hesitated. "I need time to think," was all he could manage to say. Time, the same word he used to analyze a risky investment. But that time, he knew, was a luxury his son didn't have. When Sophie learned about the complaint through a devastated Alex, the pain was different. It wasn't the public humiliation of the first time. It was something deeper. It was the personification of her greatest fear, that of not belonging, of being seen as an intruder, a usurper. The accusation of substituting the maternal figure hurt her in the most sacred place. She loved Leo, but never, not for a second, did she wish to erase the memory of his mother. She was a caregiver, a bridge. And now the accusation transformed her into a villain. That night, with a broken heart, she made the decision she believed was the only one possible to protect everyone. She would sacrifice herself. Putting Leo to bed, she hugged him a little tighter. Then she went to the living room, where Alex was looking at the illuminated city but not seeing it. "I resign," she said, her voice firm to hide the tremor. "It's best for Leo. I can't be the cause of more pain for him, or for you." The phrase hung in the air, final and irrevocable. Leo, standing at the bedroom door, heard it. His small fists clenched. The light, which had returned to his eyes with so much effort, disappeared. He turned around, entered his room, and in silence, began to line up all his small cars on the window ledge. It was the moment when everything, absolutely everything, seemed lost. The days following Sophie's departure were a dive into the abyss. The apartment, stripped of her voice and gentle presence, became a tomb of glass and marble. Silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of before, but a heavy silence loaded with loss and unspoken words. Alex felt like a ghost in his own home, a billionaire who could buy anything in the world except the sound of his son's laughter. Leo had completely shut down. The video game remained off, the screen dark as a mirror of his apathy. He no longer drew. He only lined up his cars and dinosaurs, creating physical barriers that mirrored the walls he had rebuilt in his mind. Alex tried everything. He bought new toys, suggested outings, even tried to narrate a car race on TV, but his voice sounded false, a poor echo of the melody they had lost. His financial empire felt like a bad joke. What was the use of having a 9-figure net worth if he couldn't generate a single dividend of joy in his own home? The turning point came on Friday, the day of the week that previously marked the start of a small celebration with pizza and a movie chosen by Leo. Alex arrived from the office, exhausted by another day of fighting to stop the bleeding in his business. The door opened to the usual silence. But entering the living room, something caught his attention. On the sofa, where Sophie used to sit, was the routine notebook she had made. She had forgotten it in the haste of her departure. He picked it up with a reverence he didn't dedicate even to his most important contracts. He flipped through the pages, each pictogram a bittersweet memory. Breakfast, the park outing, the yes and no workshop. It was the map to a treasure he had let slip through his fingers. He reached the last page. There was a drawing he hadn't seen before. Leo had done it, probably on that last terrible night. It was a video game controller. 3 wires came out of it, each connected to a heart. And underneath, with an effort that showed in the strength of the stroke, was the phrase, "Playing with her makes me brave." Brave. It wasn't happy. It was brave. The word exploded in Alex's mind with the force of a revelation. Sophie didn't just give Leo joy. She gave him courage. Courage to try, to speak, to connect, to face the noisy world outside. And he, Alexander Thorne, the titan of business, with all his wealth and power, had taken that away from his son. He finally understood, with a clarity that hurt. The choice was not between his reputation and the truth, between capital and affection. It was between living a life of appearances, protecting an empty fortune, or building a life of truth, protecting his son's courage. Without thinking, he grabbed his car keys. He didn't call lawyers, didn't consult spreadsheets. For the first time, his decision wasn't an investment, it was an act of faith. He drove to her neighborhood, the luxury car an anomaly on the narrow, lively streets. He found her street, a simple avenue with children playing on the sidewalk. And there she was, sitting on the grass of a small community park, in the center of a circle of neighborhood kids. She didn't look sad, she looked at home. With her notebook on her lap, she guided the little ones in a collaborative game, her soft voice calming disputes and encouraging the shy ones. She was a force of nature, a creator of bridges. Alex got out of the car, his heart pounding. He approached, and the children looked at him with curiosity. Sophie looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. He stopped before her, stripped of all his armor. "I got everything wrong," he said, his voice raw, without a script. "I spent my life building a fortune, but I let my house become a place of fear. I want to build a different life, a life where my son is the only priority. And in that life, your voice needs a place, because it was your courage that taught us both how to breathe again." Alex's words hung in the air of the small park, disarming Sophie completely. The children around, sensing the density of the moment, fell silent. She saw him, not as the unattainable multimillionaire, but as a man who had crossed the desert of his own solitude to ask for help. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, and in it recognized the same fragility she felt. She stood up, the grass dust on her simple pants, and nodded. She didn't need promises, only that raw truth. The return to the coast was different. There was no longer the invisible barrier between the driver and the passenger. There was a silent partnership, forged in shared pain and hope. The 7th week began with the force of a hurricane. On Monday, Alex did not go to the office. From his home desk overlooking the sea, he made the first of a series of calls that would redefine his empire. The first was to Sergio. It was short. "Consider our contract terminated. My image, from now on, is not for sale. It will be a reflection of my actions." The second decision was deeper. He called an emergency meeting with his board and announced a radical change in his business philosophy, the creation of an inclusion program with priority positions for people on the autism spectrum and their families. He earmarked a significant portion of the company's capital to fund the project. "The greatest profit we can have," he told the shocked executives, "is human capital. Stop treating people like liabilities." The next step was to resolve the school issue. He called Miss Vance and, with glacial calm, made a final offer. He invited her and her entire pedagogical team to a comprehensive training session with Dr. Sharma, fully funded by him. The response was what he expected, a polite refusal, disguised as a full schedule and internal protocols. The resistance was confirmation that this environment would never be safe for Leo. That same day, Alex enrolled his son in another institution, a public school in the neighboring district, which didn't have the elite varnish but possessed something infinitely more valuable, a real inclusive proposal and a sensory resource room that was a benchmark in the city. The news dropped like a bomb. The switch from one of the most expensive schools in LA to a public institution became a headline in gossip blogs and business columns. The criticisms were fierce. "Billionaire eccentricity," said one. "It will compromise the boy's future," predicted another. The value of his stock suffered another hit. Members of his social circle called incredulous, treating his decision as an act of madness that would destroy his legacy. But then an unexpected movement began. An email, then another. Dozens of messages from parents of children with disabilities who were living the same injustice in silence began to arrive. They praised his courage, shared their own stories of humiliation and exclusion. An online support group spontaneously emerged, using Alex's stance as a banner. He realized that his act of paternal love had unintentionally become a political act. He was no longer alone in his fight. The week ended. The financial storm continued outside, but inside the apartment, for the first time, peace reigned. Alex's wealth was no longer in stock market charts, but in the scene before him. Leo, sitting on the floor, carefully organizing his supplies for the first day at the new school. Beside him, Sophie helped him label the notebooks with dinosaur stickers. There was no more fear in his eyes, only the nervous expectation of a new beginning. The main conflict was resolved, but their journey as a new family was just beginning. The 8th week arrived like a gentle breeze after the storm. It was a clear night, and the salty air from the ocean blew in through the open balcony, carrying away the last traces of the cold silence that once reigned there. Leo returned from the new school with a lightness Alex hadn't seen in years. The integration day had been a success, with respected rest time, protective headphones that no one viewed as strange, and peers who learned to combine signals to invite him to play. He experienced, perhaps for the first time, the feeling of belonging. He didn't need to hide. He could just be Leo. The first thing he did upon arriving was not to turn on the video game or retreat to his dinosaurs. It was to look for Alex and Sophie, who were talking in the kitchen about the week's menu. "Dad, Sophie, come here." His voice, clear and unhesitant, was the most beautiful music that had ever played in that room. The two followed him to the sofa, anxious curiosity in the air. Leo picked up the video game controller, the object that had gone from refuge to bridge and was now a symbol of union. He turned on the device, navigated the menu with the confidence of an expert, and put it on cooperative mode. On the selection screen, he lined up the 3 avatars: a large, strong dinosaur, an agile heroine with long hair, and a small, fast velociraptor. Before the game's countdown began, he placed the controller in his lap, closed his eyes, inhaled deeply through his nose, and slowly let out the air through his mouth. The small breathing technique, learned in the yes and no workshop, executed perfectly in a moment of pure autonomy. Then, with a clear and firm voice, he articulated the phrase he had kept in his heart since the drawing. "You make me happy, Mommy." The silence that followed was chilling. The word "mommy" didn't sound like substitution, but like the purest and most childlike definition of safe harbor. Sophie's tears came silently, warm, wetting her face without her making any effort to contain them. They were tears of validation, of relief, for every humiliation suffered, for every closed door. Alex felt his own tears flowing behind his glasses, but he didn't care to hide them. They were the liquidation of old guilt, the most precious dividend he had ever received. Leo, noticing the emotion of the two, did something no therapy had ever managed to provoke. In a gesture of pure spontaneity and empathy, he leaned in and touched his forehead to Sophie's, a touch of absolute affection and connection. In that moment, Alex looked at the woman who had transformed his mausoleum of luxury into a home and finally embraced the feeling that frightened and saved him. "I can't promise fairy tales," he began, his voice choked, "but I promise presence. I promise to walk together, slowly, at the pace Leo teaches us." The balcony filled with the smell of home cooking coming from the kitchen. The video game played the sound of victory, and the city below pulsed, indifferent to the small revolution happening on that 20th floor. The journey wasn't over. There would still be sideways glances and daily struggles, but the rules were now clear. Respected routine, communicated choices, active listening, and love without spectacle. The romance was sealed with a shy, almost secret kiss, after the boy, laughing, handed them both an extra controller. Now we're three on the same team. Alex's true fortune was no longer in investment funds or high-yield applications. It was right there, in those two pairs of eyes that looked at him with confidence. The audience, who sat on the edge of their seats with every injustice, every stumble, finally breathes, knowing that this victory cost courage, renunciation, and the refusal to accept anything less than a real home.